May I ask really people to come closer? Anyway, the idea was, since this is a stakeholder meeting and the idea is to get input, we're not going to lecture you neither on our conclusions nor on our discussions. I suppose some of you have read the papers, the short or the long versions, and some haven't, but that's not a problem because I think those for whose work the papers are relevant and useful will have read them or can read them in the future, and those who are practitioners and truly don't have the time or the specific interest to read what is the state of the art of research on European identity and its relation to European cultural heritage don't need to read them. What we would like is to have an interactive session and try to get your, your 2 pennies, as they call it, a penny for your thought, your 2 thoughts, your two pennies for this. So we have basically 3 questions that we would like you to address. We will start with one. You have to work in pairs. That's why we changed. So you can either choose or just work with the person next to you. Of course, ideally, Rafil was truly saying that it would be good if a more policy or practice-oriented person sits with an academic person and vice versa, but let us not be perfectionists. I think it suffices you work with the person next to you. The reason for this is that this should not be a silent exercise. You should speak to the person next to you and come up with an idea. So our first question is, what does it mean for you to be European? You might say a very, how can I say, cliched question. And, or, if you have the time, what is European culture for you? And it doesn't have to be an individual thing. So you have 10 to 15 minutes and you have to work in pairs. We can either work in pairs like as you sit, that's why we said come closer, because then we're going to discuss what each person thinks what it is to be European and what is European culture. And it is supposed to be, as I said, not just sitting down and writing what you think, but discussing with the other person, okay, what is it for me to be European and what is European culture for me? May I remind you that our session was the one on identity and inclusion and exclusion, so how European identity includes or excludes some people, and we have had already a preliminary discussion within the project consortium of the fact that sometimes we pay too much attention, for instance, to the fringes, to the minorities and the migrants as the place where identity becomes real. But some people who might be considered as average or mainstream or, the silent white middle class, lower middle class majority are not asked what they think or how they feel included or excluded. So exclusion can come from the margins, but it can also come from the center, so to speak. So you have, 10 minutes.
That's 2 questions.
Well, it's 2 in 1.
We're going to charge you for more.
So there are 2 more coming, okay? But
that's only the first.
That's the first one.
The first.
That's 2 in 1, and we'll give you 10 minutes, and then we'll have a plenary, okay? And then we'll move on to the second one. I'm sorry?
Yeah, so it's 2, I don't know. Well, of course, it can also be 3. If
I was going to say, you can be 3 too,
or 2.
puissance cette puissance qui a fait une domination du monde. Et ça, marque aussi notre relation avec le reste du monde. Alors, cette idée que nous sommes en continent d'écran, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Mais c'est vrai que j'ai des énormes difficultés dans le monde culturel. Je ne fais pas partie de la corporation ibéro-américaine. Mais en même temps, j'ai une relation culturelle avec notre voisin de l'Amérique latine. J'ai une autre relation forte avec notre voisin latin de l'Europe. Et ça, comme ça. Alors, il y a, d'un point de vue culturel, je ne suis pas sûr qu'il existe peut-être dans ce sens-là, il existe un espace partagé de dialogue qui s'attribue surtout à partir de la cosmopolite. Ça, où est-ce que les bâtiments
il y a des éléments de certitude qui sont rares. Tu as dit par exemple, occidental, là, c'est quelque chose qui ne peut pas être partagé par tout le monde. Et ça a beaucoup de conséquences. Occidental, dans un certain modèle, dans une certaine relation. C'est la démocratie et la religion. Là, il y a quand même quelque chose qui n'est pas forcément totalement original. Là, il y a quelque chose qui marque la géographie, mais occidentale. C'est un premier élément qui marque les certitudes sur les plans spirituels. Le projet politique, on parlait au Roustos, c'est une certitude. C'est une certitude. Il y a un projet politique. Les frontières, là aussi,
ça c'est une autre région du monde, il y a cette liberté passer des frontières évidemment, ça change la même. C'est vrai, il y a différents périmètres.
parce qu'il n'y a pas de vision
il y a déjà cette l'Europe, et l'Europe, c'est l'Europe nord-occidentale. On va à l'Europe, on traverse les Pyrénées. Parce qu'on était des dictatures et on avait des rêves d'une Europe.
C'est la même chose pour l'Est.
C'est la même chose. On disait la frontière de l'Europe ici. Alors, et je pense que l'Europe de l'Est c'est exactement le même.
Je pense que l'Occident, ça fait partie de la certitude. Mais cette certitude, elle est limitée par rapport à toutes les incertitudes de l'Europe. Peut-être structure de complication du
le maillage des paroisses. Européens vont reconnaître les Européens qui veulent des les gens tiennent.
Dans les incertitudes, il y a l'incertitude sur l'adhésion, sur les frontières,
So
sur les divisions et sur le rapport
you can also,
sur l'alternance.
there's no marking at the end, so you can also give tentative answers. There's no. So who would like to start?
We'll start.
Okay, good, Ulrike.
Because we had a really exciting debate just now. So I think this is going to, once again, we're going to put, once again, I'm going to put the cat among the pigeons because my very exciting neighbor here has 4 passports and multiple identities and complexities, and she utterly rejects the question. So we are starting by somebody who's saying it means absolutely nothing to her to ask that question. What does it mean to be European as long as she's in a room which is made up of people like me? I don't mean me as an individual. I mean, at least we share the gender, you know. But apart from that, you know, we share nothing at all. So she kind of wants to ask the question in a different sort of way, you know. How do we actually engage in a way that doesn't always marginalize people who are not white and who are not who don't have access to all the same kind of means?
This is our third question.
So that's the first question.
But
And
my first question very much was, I refuse to answer that question
Yeah.
in a room full of white people.
that was what she said.
Okay.
Okay.
And I'm for
Yeah.
a number of elaborate reasons.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry.
But she was quite happy to answer what is European culture, because that was something she thinks is very relevant. It means engage. It's what is made in or engaging Europe, and it's a geographical concept. Now, we didn't get around to talking about what I think, but I think mine is so much more mainstream that I can just simply say very briefly.
Tell us about what it means to be European.
What it means to be European to me is it's actually a really warm identity. I love being European because I'm German and a post-war post-Second World War West German, and that was always a very complicated identity, and from very early on I embraced being European as a way to being, in a sense, I suppose, cosmopolitan. I think of myself obviously as being a very privileged member of an educated global elite. I speak 4 languages, or even more if you count a few words of Greek. And so yes. Milau Ilenika, legal. Okay, and for me, what does it mean to be, what does European culture mean? It's obviously a completely open concept, because there is no such thing. You can't kind of limit European culture to what is happening in particular nations, because it's never been. I mean, we've obviously, you know, I think most people would possibly agree that European culture is made up of endless numbers of streams of people coming in and out and enriching it, and we'd be absolutely the poorer for it. And that's one of the reasons why I love being European, precisely because it's not really European in the sense of its strict limitations. Is that right? Okay.
I would like to ask the group of 3 people over there to give their thoughts. Will you? Yeah?
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it.
Okay.
Say your name.
My name's Alice. I meant to just be taking the minutes, but apparently now I'm going to be talking about what does it mean to be European. I talked about it from a UK perspective, because I often think that I actually was working in a secondary school for 5 years for 11 to 18-year-olds, and none of my students would have called themselves European. They were very into calling themselves, well, English. And then we talked about that as a comparison to, for example, the Republic of Ireland, where because then we talked about whether UK being an island, whether that made a difference, and us not being part of the continent as such. But then I said that when I went to Dublin, I felt actually that they connected a lot more with being European. So that's anything else?
Well, what does it mean For you, did you come to a common agreement? What does it mean for you to be European?
I'm not European. I don't know. That's why you gave the microphone for her, you know, because you have an idea about what can be, but I don't know. She's there.
Okay, what would be European culture? What would be European culture for your group?
I mean, the only thing that you said, we started by the common points that probably don't believe that there is something like a European culture or anything like that. But then we discussed the hypothesis, maybe that there is something like what can bring different kind of European cultures together is the idea of being in the avant-garde of something. Europe as the place in which, because of some internal transformative process that happen here, have this pole of push others together, you know, like other parts of the world and other different kind of things. And I think that's the only thing that I believe that maybe, at least you know, it has manifested in historical terms in a lot of shapes, and maybe that's what is still making a European culture of something that you can say that, I don't know, something that can bring together different.
Okay, so thank you very much. So we have, I think, one is an emphasis on the transformative power of European culture rather than some kind of cultural content, and a geographical definition of European culture. Can I ask you too?
Europe, so.
Well, first of all, next to me is a person who is Hungarian, Swiss, with a Dutch wife, and so on and so forth. So this is what we first believe, that diversity is the typical trait. But then we are wondering, this is what we think about ourselves, whether from the outside it is so, whether an African would believe that all the Europeans are so boring, they are all alike, and we Africa or we Latin America are the real diversity. So it's very difficult. What 3 or 4 of you heard already from me yesterday, I'm sorry to repeat, that the real thing for me is, in these cases, the perception from outside. What is that outsiders from other parts of the world, other continents, other cultures, believe of European culture? For example, just go to the second part of the question. Most of it, they wouldn't find any difference from theirs. Yes, that kind of avant-garde, yes, that is still a kind of European feature. But probably, I believe, there is a lot of, a considerable part of cultural performance, whatever it is, that from the outside could be perceived as typically European. I don't know what it is. Something which is attached to Europe, which brands Europe or some part of it, or on the contrary, which devalues, which harms. So a branding which can be counterproductive. And finally, and that is where I don't know whether we agreed, but I still believe that the basis of European identities is values, and especially tolerance, which is probably, to my belief, is more typical, openness and tolerance to this continent than all the others.
Did I understand you wanted to?
Thank you. Well, we talked a bit about European high culture as a powerful form of knowledge that's deployed for class distinction purposes and has spread all over the world. But I wanted to bring it back to sort of European policy and practice. I was in Glasgow when we were a European City of Culture in 1990, which marked the shift from a cultural festival to an economic regeneration festival. And I don't think there was any sense of European identity. And we're doing another big European festival in 2018, and we will try to do European things, but I would be very surprised if we engage in any sense of European identity among the actually the arts organizations as well as the citizens of the city.
I agree.
So this is an answer to our previous question about economy and culture.
I think the question of class differentiation, which we haven't discussed, and how one accesses culture is really very important, and it has not gone away. It's not entirely fashionable to discuss it, but it characterizes relations across all the European states, I think, and we shouldn't forget it. And then, of course, you could add to that, question you raised about inclusion and exclusion, and clearly the whole. I mean, we also discussed actually the kind of difficult position of white working class men, at least in the UK, as a kind of as a group that really merits very little consideration or analysis. And then, of course, in terms of the discussion we had yesterday, the kind of repercussions of the latest wave of migration and what that then raises about how otherness is constructed, seems to have been very dramatically put on the agenda. It's not as though that question has ever gone away, but it's absolutely staring us in the face right now. So I think would we say that's it from Glasgow? Glasgow signing off. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ask you actually, we in the name of diversity, we had a French-speaking exchange here.
Perhaps first of all, the European identity is a problem. It's a problem because the kind of certainty we have about this is very little thing with respect with the uncertainty that is the basis of European identification. So what we discussed was the first, perhaps the only aspect of European identity is a rooted Occidental belonging. This is certain. But for the other aspects, the borders, the political project, the sense to be European is very divided. And the history of Europe is a conflictual one. Perhaps one of the identification to European behavior is the fact to have left so many conflicts and to be informed with those conflicts, even in each city for religious reasons and so on and so forth. So what we stand about European identity is the rejection of European identity as an essence and the force of European identification as a project.
Okay, thank you very much. Do you want to reflect on culture, or you didn't? You had no time. Can I ask you guys? Did you speak more about European culture or what it means for you to be Europeans? Yeah.
Thank you. Well, we similarly actually had this thing about accepting ambiguity, I think, as part of European identity, both because in our own personal lives we've crossed borders, live across borders, have loves across borders, and those kind of things. But ambiguity seems to be part of the European project, and it's something we've internalized. We're not necessarily totally comfortable with it, because we've both started from a position, this is what we agreed on, that we had been cultural relativists, pure cultural relativists at a certain point in our deep pasts, but we've now got to a position of actually thinking there is good culture and bad culture. And that's something that's really tricky and tough to deal with. You know, if Europe represents an idea and a model of tolerance, it's one that has a tough, critical, ethnocentric, Eurocentric edge. And personal liberties are something that we value, but they're something that Europe wants to impose on its citizens, generally speaking. We can look at this from a feminist perspective or a sexualities perspective. And we like the idea that there's sexual equality, that there is an equality of sexualities within the European space, which there isn't anyway, because in the UK now, of course, gay marriage is possible. It's possible in other European states, but by no means all of them. But the European project actually means that we now have, let's say, homosexual marriage tourism happening within a European space to force recognition by other member states that are stuck to a religiously driven idea that you cannot have same-sex couples. Italians coming to the UK to marry and then going back and saying, okay, recognize our certificate. So that's an interesting thing, but at the same time, we recognize those are perhaps particular Eurocentric values that we're trying to push. But we're kind of comfortable with it. We come from that background.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. So an element is imposing, well, being critical and transformative, but also not very critical towards liberalism, so imposing liberalism. Can I ask Nasser and the other gentleman?
Thank you. Quite a lot of what we wanted to say has been said already. So, I think we think that this question of European identity is more to be found in common values. I think the idea of Peter of the tolerance as a common factor is something very important. We just want to draw your attention maybe on something that has not been said so far, which is that all people who live in Europe do not share the same idea of what is to be European. Again, the kids, for example, living in deprived areas, see others, the ones who are not coming from the immigration, they call them Europeans, and which means it's not us, it's somebody else. Even if they are Australian, they are not us, they are Europeans. And sorry?
Who calls whom Europeans?
For example, the young people from the immigration who live in our suburbs. In France, they call the ones who are not coming from the immigration, Arab, African, or Asian, they call them Europeans, which is a way for them to make a difference, to kind of showing that they are not involved in this, they don't want to be involved in this integration process, although they still very much live there. And as I said yesterday, I think for these people, they belong to a family physical or a family of interest, and they belong to global networks. And they don't see the interest of intermediate political stage, including Europe or even the nation. All these notions are disappearing very fastly. And I think we have to bring back values in the center of this. Actually, what they ask is, what is the European project? I'm not sure we share all the same advice on this, and I think it's not very clear for many people, and especially for these new generations. Did I forget something? That's all right.
Thank you. Can I ask Sabrina and Volker?
Typical sociologists answer yes and no. So when we discussed this, I had to look back into my own biography, as a lot of us probably do. That's the yes. The further I'm away from Europe, the more I feel like a European, having spent many, many years in the United States and have met a lot of other fellow Europeans. I felt more like a European than ever, being outside. The more I live in North Germany, the more I feel there's a huge difference between us in Hamburg and what are these people down there in the south, Bavarians or whatever their name is. So, that's the yes. And the no, I think it's important to remember that we are all very privileged here. This is not a representative sample of Europeans that is in this room. So we have, which means that what we found out, we find a lot of underprivileged, deprived, and somewhat forgotten people who obviously, if we look at the last votes in a lot of elections in Europe, vote for nationalist parties. And so there's something wrong about this. But there's, from a sociological perspective, it's something that I can explain why this happens. These kind of protests were votes that are mostly drawn to the right. Interesting enough, not so much to the left. At least that's what I would say. So.
This is what we said. Yeah. Okay, you're great. Let us move on to actually. I'll ask them later. I mean, for the interest of covering the different themes, and actually we will make our third question second, because I think it ties very nicely with the question of identity, basically what you were raising. So our other question was, do you think European identity has a potential of inclusion or exclusion towards migrants and historical minorities? And we draw this distinction as migrants or post-migration minorities. I know it's a fuzzy distinction, because you might say, okay, how long do you have to be in some place to be a native minority? But I think it reflects perhaps a reality that distinguishes Central Eastern Europe, that has a lot of native populations who are ethnic or linguistic or national minorities, and Western Europe having some of those plus more of previously labor migration that have become ethnic minorities. And again, the terminology varies a lot between countries. So we would like you to reflect for another 10 minutes on if you think the European identity has a potential for inclusion. We know that, for instance, in international law, the Council of Europe in particular, but also the EU has taken steps to, particularly for historical minorities, to protect minority cultures, to recognize their specificity, you know, education rights, linguistic rights, etc. We would say much less so for migrants, which remains totally different, supposed to be a totally different question. But we can see an inclusionary potential also to the extent that European identity is kind of taming nationalisms. But at the same time, for the reasons that I think you two raised, European identity can be seen very exclusionary, because for many it's white and Christian, and everything else is not properly European. So can you take 5 to 10 minutes to think of this?
What do you mean by you're like... What do you mean by European identity? As in the words? As in the passport? As in the, I mean... As in the idea?
That's part of the exercise. I mean, exactly. Well, I think the answers showed that there's no, you know, but even if I ask you what is French identity, I think we can spend 2 hours discussing what is French identity. So I think for identity, it's exactly like this. There's no one single definition. You can, I mean, discuss it with your partner and say the legal status is important.
When I
Hello. I think I'll first give the floor. Have you finished? I'll first give the floor to this group that hasn't spoken before. So, what do you think about our question?
What? Okay. You know the argument. Just in relation to the previous discussion, you all were talking about lofty high culture and all these ideas like tolerance and so on. It's all okay, but we were just discussing also the issue that, well, there is a European identity which is created through low culture, like football fandom, and Euro contest, Eurovision contest. Millions of people do participate in it, and they feel Europeans at this moment in European Championship and so on and so forth. And we've just discussed the position of Barca in the European, Europe making. But answering this, what?
You're not saying soccer is a European thing.
For European Championship is a European thing, plus Israel and Turkey. And Kazakhstan. Well, the part of Kazakhstan which is in geographic Europe is bigger than the Netherlands. And so well, but with respect to this question, well, the answer is twofold and very, very tricky, because there is a contradiction in it that for some people, let's say, just make it very rough, rightist-minded people, there is a European identity and they want to defend European identity by being exclusive. We don't want others here because we have this European identity that we have to defend against all this, you know. And then for the liberally minded people, defending Europe means being inclusive because of tolerance and human rights and all these things like this.
Can I just add, my answer to the first question in a way contains the answer to this one. My natural inclination would be to answer the question about being European in much of the terms of Ulrike, but I hesitate to do that because I think it would be the wrong answer, simply because it would exclude the low culture, the identity of the vast majority of people who might be, in other terms, considered to be European, and that might raise the question whether we should use different criteria altogether. But it seems to me that the de facto condition of being European today is something to do with rights, and that one is the bearer of rights, and maybe one should pose the terms what is to be European in entirely different terms. And that's why I also hesitated to give my natural answer to being European. It's, you know, crossing borders, speaking different languages, and being cosmopolitan. But the vast majority of Europeans are not.
But that was why I was being critical about myself. I mean, I was saying it in order to contrast it with what she was saying, in order to say I consider myself as a privilege.
Oh, yes, I know.
Yeah, so it's
yeah, I mean, sorry that I butt in, but it's very, very important that when I say these things, that I consider myself as part of a global elite, it's because I know precisely what an exclusive little club that is, and that we are members of that exclusive club, and it excludes millions of others. And I mean, I don't like the European Song Contest, but I was very much delighted to have a transvestite with a little beard from Austria winning it, you know, so it's not as if it's completely beyond my understanding what is going on there. And my son is managing rock bands, so you know. So this is what I'm saying is I'm aware that as a member of this so-called global elite, we kind of have discourses about everything. We can discuss exactly in the same vein what's happening at the European Song Contest as we can discuss what's happening at Wagner in Bayreuth. And it's that which is our privilege. It's not that we are in a little niche of only high culture. It's because we exactly, the 68 generation occupied the lot, and I'm still sitting there, and I'm still occupying the lot. So that's the problem. That's the critique I'm making. Yeah, sorry.
Can I ask you, however, to discuss a bit the question of diversity? Like, is it inclusion? Is European identity today having a function of inclusion or exclusion? And I don't know if you two want to say something because you felt very. But no, but if you don't, then I would give the floor to this group here, because you spoke already.
Do it. No, do. Please.
Okay. We had some really quite interesting conversation. Partly was reflection and partly was fantasy. The fantasy was about Europe as a positive ideal, comes from its capacity to produce what I would call spaces of cultural intimacy, which are mostly, not utopian by any means, but in the sense that they're completely open and equal for everyone, but their scale is quite significant when you think about small European cities and their capacity, even in small European cities, to sustain a vibrant cultural life. Go to any small American, Asian, Australian city, you will not find equivalent stimuluses and cultural interactions. And from my outsider perspective, that is one of the fantasy points and the attractors to cities in Northern Europe or Southern Europe where scale does not necessarily mean the loss of cultural vitality. So that's something that we valued, and that's a very complex formation that draws from a long historical heritage, Enlightenment ideas, classical values. And we recognize that, of course, there have been exclusions within those compositions of those civic spaces. But in our fantasy world, they would become more open. And the fantasy world was also animated by the previous comments that Europe is a perpetual identity crisis. And the perpetual identity crisis is not a problem to be overcome, but a feature to be recognized, because it's like saying we're constantly arguing whether the door should be half open, quarter closed, but in that discussion, we're at least admitting the right of other people to push or pull and shape the way in which ventilation or transformation occurs. And so the identity crisis we want to recognize as a feature, not a problem to be overcome, but a feature of our own wider identity, not our local identity. And against this, however, we had some reflections about some more dark features that are in fact stronger now in our midst. And both of us had the experience in the late 80s, whereby colleagues and friends described the end of the Iron Curtain as the beginning of a new Mediterranean wall. In 1988, both me in England and she in GDR, we were both in discussions where we described, and it was described to us that this was the beginning of a new wall being built. And sure enough, this is what Frontex is all about. And maybe this is an opportunity to also talk about the way in which border management is operating in an interactive way. I don't know if anybody knows, but Frontex has a website. On their website, they show you their maps, which can interactively, in real time, identify the movement of people as they change their directions, because border guards also start to close gaps. So the smugglers, the migrants know that don't go that way because there are security guards that have now been positioned on that line, so you go this way. And now through satellite technology, Frontex is mapping the movements in real time. And so the cat and mouse game that's being played about border security is a very sophisticated communication tool as well now. And so maybe there's some issues to be talked about in terms of inclusion and exclusion. It's not just a conceptual one, but also a way of thinking about how borders are managed.
Thank you.
Can I add one issue we discussed in this context of having new walls, namely the reasons why people move. And this brings us to the point of a debate about inequalities and the systems behind. So this is a cultural phenomenon, but also an economic and social one. So, yes.
Yeah, we talked a lot about, in the past, the motivator to make people move from your home to another place was if you had the potential to do your same job and get more than 5 times the return. If it's less than 5 times, you go, why bother? Why would I bother leaving Naples to live in this horrible place called Venice if I'm only going to get twice the money, right? So no one goes from Naples to Venice because it's only twice the money. But when the difference becomes, say, from sub-Saharan Africa to Naples becomes a difference of 1 to 200 or 1 to 2,000, then the tipping point is well and truly past. And so what we've recognized, what we were discussing, is that the polarization that's now occurring in the world is far more intense. Yeah. So politicians talk about lifting people out of poverty, which is bullshit, because what they've lifted them into is into the exposure of the intensification of the polarization that's occurring. And that is creating greater destabilization. So the economic issues were very central to this identity crisis and of exclusion and inclusion.
Thank you.
Our group was a 4-people group, so the 4 of us spontaneously merged, and we spoke about different issues, like the difference between identity and identification, and we found more appropriate to talk about identification to emphasize the process, while identity will be the more fixed form of it, and therefore we spoke about especially the fact how much your identity is imposed on you, on how other people see you, what is the framework within which you act, and so what is your position, what are your rights, what are your entitlements, depending on each different context and situation. And then there was another issue that I raised on the necessity of you should not approach this debate today in a naive way. Then I'm following up on what was said before. If we are puzzled by what is European identity, there are many people in Europe and outside that are not puzzled. They know very well what are the fundamental European values. And I was mentioning the need of looking back at the history of colonialism. And anytime we think about the processes of acculturation towards European values and identities and religion, etc., that has been done through centuries of history, there we have a very clear list of what was taught by the conquistadores, by the missionaries, by the governments in the past, what was the fundamental elements of European identity. So the question for us today, I mean, we could play the game of looking back at this kind of text, with this kind of heritage, that's also part of our heritage, and look at what elements of this list could be used not in a forced acculturation, a process of forced acculturation, forced inclusion, but in a process of more participatory, democratic form of inclusion. And then I want to mention something that I mentioned yesterday in a group. If you go to the National Museum of Bogota today, they have a special room that they are inaugurating. They want to change the way they do museum, the National Museum there. And there they produced a room which has been done in a participatory way. So by all Colombians from every ethnic group. And they put together at the same level artwork from the 19th century and tapestry done by displaced women, victims of the war today. So then the question will be, if we go back to this list of what historically speaking the fundamental European values, the fundamental European cultural items, I'm surprised that we did not speak about the fact we need to identify items of cultural heritage in this group. We are not thinking about the European value. I mean, cultural heritage gets concrete, materializes in items. No? So if we have to make a list of what are these fundamental items, we can maybe recuperate some of the items from the past, but we have to be open to create new ones and how these are produced.
I'd like to ask partner to react on the inclusionary or exclusionary potential
Thank you very much. We had a very interesting discussion on this inclusion-exclusion question because Marina is from Serbia, I'm from Hungary, one country inside, one outside of the Schengen borders. On the main road today of immigrants or refugees to the European Union. And what we saw, it was that apparently it's possible to use European identification or identity both for inclusion and exclusion discourses. And it seems to be that it depends very much on political will and political culture. So it seems to be as a sort of a available toolkit that anyone can use for practically anything. And it relates to your first question, that it seems to be that identification is really constructed in conflict situation, in border situation, in meetings. So it depends very much on the context. And what we saw that it was mentioned by some of you that European identity or identification is not really related to the European project. It is something more, it's deeper, it's cultural. But it seems to be that, for example, in Serbia, Europe is not part of the discourse of being to welcome well the refugees in Serbia and to help them. It seems to be more related to a national context. While in Hungary, there is a populist campaign very much related to Europeanness and the sort of historical interpretation or heritage of history, which relates the current crisis to the fight against the Turks and the Muslims in the 15th, 16th and 17th century. While in other parts of Europe, we see that other elements of history are mobilized. It is a counterexample of the dark sides of European history, which motivates a welcoming culture in Germany, or a continuation of the enlightened approach in parts of the French or Belgian society. So I think there is a very strong relation to history interpretations. So absolutely a double-edged issue, and identity, as we saw that during history, can be used both for inclusion and exclusion. It was just the beginning of a very interesting discussion. Thank you.
So what is your?
I think most of what we discussed has been said. Maybe just to add one point. What I will say later, it derives from what I say now. And what I say now is, if you look at Europe, has the first attempt in human history to build a sovereignty which is not resulting from the victory of someone or someone else. That, as an implication to me, is that you don't have an identity. You need a process of identification. And if you look at that way, then I can't state whether, I can state that I don't want to have a European identity. I think what I would like is to have a constant process of being honestly related to this very fundamental element, which is the building a common sovereignty as a project. And it's not a crystallized identity, which is the one that we have behind the states or the things. If we look at this...
You say serenity, like in the sense of peace.
Yeah. And if so, then the answer is the European project this way, in principle, potentially capable to be influenced and open, not tolerant, open to diverse? The answer is yes. In the very moment it becomes an identity, then the answer is a big question mark. And I think that is where you have a switch. Because identity is necessarily related to whatever has been told in terms of history before. It's
that's very interesting thing. That's very interesting. Thank you. Actually, I think what comes out of this discussion, yeah, I'll give you just what comes out of this discussion. No one spoke about race. No one spoke about historical minorities, and you mostly spoke about border management and about poverty and inequality, which I think shifts as testifies to a certain shift of the debate today, quite rightly, from what is politically hot and probably politically and morally important is, yeah, what we do at our borders and what you were saying about, you know, polarization of inequality. And I think what you were also reflecting to now, rather than what I would call the more, should I call them classical debates for us academics about identity, which include exactly race, ethnicity, religion, etc. So that was my reflection.
Yeah, so I just wanted to quickly add that the conversation we had is very complementary to what Sabrina and Luca also said. It was surprising that in the first round of questions, no one of us has referred to the Holocaust, World War II, the very reasons why Europe started, where the exclusion of others or the otherness in religious otherness, sexual otherness, political otherness led to the ultimate exclusion of extinction. And where we now, as being Europeans, are Europeans because we are interested in healing, interested in overcoming post-colonial, totalitarian, whatever kind of terrible pasts. And in Germany, where Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with past, is something very natural, and I feel very comfortable with my guilt. It gives me a lot of freedom. But we also in our conversation came to the conclusion that that coming to terms with the past has not happened in most of the European states, and that there is a European collective past which requires some kind of coming to terms with it. And that includes those on the outside, because there are the colonial ties, there are the wars, there are, I mean, you know, it reaches out to those areas of Europe that belong to Europe also, where the migrants come from now. So if we would manage to enter into a kind of conversation about what the painful areas are that we need to come to terms with, we may open spaces of new narratives, like in the Bogota Museum or so, where we may have as an item Auschwitz or whatever, complemented with a very positive cultural image of what that leads to, whatever it may be.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I think it's all very important and interesting. There's a third part, and then that stands between us and our lunch. So our third question is a bit more, how can I say, instrumental. And our third question was, now it is more direct towards the stakeholders, the people who work with arts and culture, or policymakers. So is European culture relevant for your daily work? So whether you are a museum curator, an artist, somebody who works in the media, or somebody who is a local or regional councillor, a policymaker, or has been a policymaker. So is European culture relevant for your daily work? And perhaps one might also say, or European cultural policy. And for the researchers, the question is do you think that European culture or European cultural policy is relevant today for artists, museum curators, etc.? So again, you have the 10 minutes coming up with.
It's a place in Europe, but it's not European. It's international. Top down. That's quite instrumental as well. Have a clarification. Well, yes, I agree that nevertheless there's no
that plunders in the British, the other plunders in the high station.
It's different in the British made it important. Of course, but it's all British coffee. You know, putting it as a stage.
Things to remember about the as a lawyer, he would make the best of his try and obviously nobody's able to where they got the stuff.
It's very remarkable.
His first degree, he qualified
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. That's the Greeks.
Yeah, that was a really good series.
I hope you came up with some ideas to share with us. I'll start with the people at the back, Gabriele and Jean-Louis, who haven't spoken yet. So what's your answer to our question?
Well, the question is, again, is European culture relevant for daily work, for our daily work? And we try to distinguish the daily work of cultural actors, practitioners, protagonists, and so forth, and the cultural work of those, and the work of those who are involved and interested in, or working in support of cultural policy, for instance, or cultural interactions seen as beneficial to mutual enhancement of knowledge, skills, experience, and so forth. And from that point of view, from the latter point of view, we have noted how, from the very beginning, Europe gave itself a major mandate, both in the recognition of the importance of the cultural heritage of Europe and what had to be done to nurture it, to protect it, and to enhance it. And in particular, the Cultural Convention was which for Greater Europe, and when the European Union was just at its beginnings, dates back to 1954, and emphasized the importance of heritage, including linguistic heritage, and the historical heritage as a base for the European project the project of European construction. And it is later on than this, within this framework, and also thanks to the development of the world of civil society and non-governmental initiatives in Europe, that it was possible for the European institutions to support and to encourage the birth and the multiplication of networks, which was one of the most important phenomena in the, in terms of cultural cooperation in the 70s and 80s. So then let us not forget that, the effect of the governmental support to cultural policy at regional, local, and national levels, which has been the outcome of a constant process, not only of ritual and regular gatherings of ministers of culture dealing with this or that aspect over the years, including some of the issues that we are dealing with today, the immigration of the cultural development of migrant workers and their families. That dates back to 1960, the beginning of 1960. And some of these issues are very, very present today, whereas we have a tendency to say that everything has changed since yesterday. This is a statement that probably has to be modulated a little bit. And then from the point of view, from a more socio-psychological point of view, the richness of programs such as Erasmus in the field of education, but also of support to networks from which some of you have been benefiting over the years, and some of us have been also witnessing and promoting, and it has actually been a sort of satisfaction to see how important to be for cultural operators from Sardinia to meet their corresponding numbers, in other regions of Europe, and to discuss relationships, between cultural development and economic growth of a region or micro-region. And this makes Europe, when you talk about building European identity, this is the sort of initiative that make Europe up. So is European culture relevant for daily work? I would say respond affirmative.
Thank you very much. So yeah, I think you're suggesting that there is a whole framework that has been created through the years. May I ask this group that has become a 4-people group to react? Do you have to add or I think you are the designated rapporteur on this case.
Let me introduce myself, Jordi Pasqual from Barcelona. I am the coordinator of United Cities and Local Governments Committee on Culture. And one of the points we discussed is the fact that Europe is a narrative, not also narrative, but also a political power, which is quite unique in the South of America or in other places in the world. There is not yet a political center which may counterbalance the national narratives and powers, sometimes quite destructive to cultural diversity. And in Europe we have some examples of that. So we discussed a little bit about this exception which Europe is at the global level. And this is quite positive. This is my personal view. It's positive that there is a continental power that can be used as a counter narrative.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask my 2 ladies here?
It's me again.
The answer, of course, is yes. And what we focused on really were what are the instruments, the very practical instruments of inclusion and exclusion that we should look more closely in. So we have 8 so far, and invite everyone else to add. But it is things of the language of delivery of cultural projects on a policy level, that the language that it's delivered in is an instrument of inclusion and exclusion. Who gets funding, whether you have an EU passport, what are the criteria for funding? What is the staff of public cultural institutions? How much do they reflect the diversity of the people whom they serve? What is people's access to arts education in schools? We know that young people are more diverse than older people demographically, and people's access to education in schools across Europe is really important. Admissions policies, do you have to pay to get in? That's a huge, huge instrument of exclusion or exclusion. Outreach demanded of public cultural institutions is a huge instrument of inclusion, exclusion. Visitor responsiveness and accountability backed by data. How much do we know about the people who actually have access to our formal or informal culture, and how much are people held accountable to that? Networks, the degree to which the different cultural institutions, I suppose, or projects. Anything with a bit of a frame around it, whether it's a festival, a project, award, whatever it is, how do we know who's using it, who's benefiting it from it, and how are we able to be flexible if we don't have that kind of data and responsiveness? The notion of networks, how often do we network with other people outside or within our sectors is an instrument of inclusion and exclusion. And the engagement with media, how often do people have access to various cultural forms? So I know it's not entirely your question, but I guess we chose to focus on instruments of inclusion or exclusion that we can deal with in this much broader, more abstract, and quite challenging question.
Yeah, I was about to say, this is all very useful, but I'm not sure it relates, yeah.
It is. How is European culture relevant in daily life? It is very relevant in as much as it impacts on these 8 things.
No, I understand. It's like these are the connecting factors somehow. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Lars would like to say something as a stakeholder. I'm thinking of who is a stakeholder and would like.
Yeah, hello. I'm here from Barcelona also, and I'm the director of the theater where you're going tonight. So I will give you like 2 minutes of publicity for the event tonight if you want. I work on a dance house, so my field is dance. And naturally I work internationally because in a sense, it would not be possible to work for me in the field of dance without European partners. And I'm not talking only about funding from the EU, but in dance it's quite natural that, for example, all the companies, choreographers, audience are international in the sense that we're working basically with movement, and that has a kind of easier way of being translated to other cultures, people from not speaking language. So that's the border of language doesn't exist. So for me, it's quite natural. And also connecting to the situation, I don't have other partners around in Spain, so I need to work internationally to collaborate, to co-produce, to promote Spanish artists abroad, to give them other opportunities that don't find locally. So being very practical, I do work internationally. Artistically, and that connects me with the show you see tonight, it's also very important to bring new seeds, new ideas, to help maybe the artist by giving them access to see other works that maybe they can further develop their identities by seeing something that is totally different, by opening up new windows maybe in the audience. So for me, this idea of working internationally is quite, as I said, central, natural, evident, and something that I do normally every day. Maybe it's not the same for all my organization. Maybe not everybody speaks English in my organization, so that's, for example, a limit. Or maybe it's sometimes even harder to invite young choreographer from Poland or from another country that presenting a work that pleases my audience. But the effort, I think it's worth the effort of working towards developing an audience for difference, and so I like that, and it's challenging for me also as a director. Can I do publicity? Or I do it at the end if you want, at the end of the session. No, I was very happy that you actually think, I don't know who was the one that chose the event for tonight, but what we're presenting tonight, I think it was you, Jordi. Okay, he was searching, scouting in Barcelona what was happening tonight to offer you something. So what we're doing tonight, the show is quite special because it's our opening, so it's an opening night, so it's the first show of the season. So we wanted to open the season by something, you know, like friendly, like easy, like because in the season there's different kinds of work. We present more contemporary, more audience friendly. Tonight it's like the opening, so there's a big party with free beer afterwards. And the show we do is something that I like is like to provoke creativity. So I like to ask the artist to go a bit further. So I don't believe in the idea of the artist left alone thinking and creating. So I think we have to provoke a bit. So we provoke. There's a very young, fresh hip-hop movement in Barcelona, which I think it's popular dance of today. So that's kind of the tradition, the popular dance that gathers young people today. We confronted them with a group of traditional music, which is Copla. Copla is the music they play for sardanas. Sardanas is like the traditional dance, not very old, 100 years old, but the music has developed quite strongly. It's now a very, very interesting development on partitures, scores, and how the sardana is like changing. So it's traditional music, popular dance of today together, and you'll see the result of this.
That was very enticing. I have another intervention.
European culture. When you work with youngsters from the deprived areas, it's very difficult to go to them and say, hi, I'm bringing you culture. Understatement, you don't have one. And I'm bringing you European culture. I mean, you take a big risk, right? So the idea is back to the cultural rights. These people, any person, is able to construct, to build his own culture referential system. And it can eventually be completely closed on itself. The real question is, once you've done that, how do they gain legitimacy? How they are recognized by the power, by the powers in general? And the difficult thing is, first, to let things grow as they should grow, and second, to accept them in this global concert. And I am very afraid of this non-respect. I'm always referring to Article number 1 of the Human Rights Declaration, which means that every individuals are equal in dignity and in right. And the word, take good note that the word dignity is even before the word right. What does it mean to be equal in dignity? It means there is no dominant culture. So this is something we have to be very aware of. I'm very cautious about this kind of cultural integration system, which I can see in some deprived areas have very negative impacts. And then to jump on another subject, which is always hanging around, which is this question of innovativity, invention, creativity. I have made very bad studies in medieval literature, but I was always struck by the way Renaissance has been using this concept of inventivity, innovation, to kind of erase from the surface of the earth what was before and has been called obscurantism, although it was a very strong expression of culture and very politic. also because it was not related to Christianity, but to something else. So we have this political issue constantly in the back, and who is allowed to be an artist, who is allowed to be creative, and who is not.
Oh, thank you. That's a very, I think, a very important and perhaps provisionally final statement for this session. So I think you're drawing our attention first to the inequality, which partly was also done by other interlocutors. So bringing, in bracketed, European culture to disadvantaged groups, and how do you do this in a way that recognizes their own dignity and capacity for culture and creativity. And I think you also added a very interesting reflection to a topic that was raised in the morning as well, innovation versus creativity, that they're very normative and very political. What is worthy of being called creative and who is worthy of being called an artist? That, I think these are very important points to take home. I think it's time to break for lunch. After lunch, we have our concluding session. We have thought of organizing this slightly differently. So I say just a couple of things about this state of the art on studies on European identity and culture. Rocío will try to summarize the points raised yesterday and now in the discussion. And Ulrike will be asked to comment on both of us and start the discussion. It's a session that lasts an hour and a quarter. So our idea is to start with about 5 to 10 minutes me, 10 minutes or 10, 15 minutes Rocío, and 5 to 10 minutes Ulrike, and then we engage into a discussion. I understand lunch is here. Where is Arturo? Lunch is here like yesterday in the big room. Thank you very much all for your contribution. That was a very interesting. It's in a restaurant. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so we follow you. Okay.